A lot of the artists I work with reach out at the same point. The track's finished, but it never quite sounds right everywhere. Car, headphones, laptop, something's always off. That's usually when mastering comes into the picture. I help synth and electronic tracks translate properly without changing the character you've worked hard on. If you're curious, there's a synth music mastering link in the show notes. And as a thank you for listening, there's a 20% discount. Just mention the code POD when you request a quote when you're ready.
Yeah, for mixed clarity. Think it starts with your arrangement and it starts with your sound choices. If you get those as close as you can to working well before you have to start reaching for lots of EQ and other things to solve problems, I would say that is a very good place to start. So, a bass sound, for instance, that works with your pad sound, that works with your guitar tone, that works with your vocal or whatever you've got in your track.
You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Marc Matthews.
Welcome to Inside the Mix, a big welcome, the podcast designed to help beginner producers understand music production and mixing in a simple, approachable way. I'm Marc Matthews, and each episode focuses on practical tips, clear explanations, and small changes that can lead to big improvements in your sound. If you're learning at home and want to feel more confident finishing your tracks, make sure you follow the show, and let's dive in. In this episode, it is the first one of 2026, not the first episode, that is, but the first time I'm joined by returning co-host guest, Tim Benson, a.k.a. R9. Now, we had a good chin wag off there, but I'll say it as I always do. Hello, Tim. How are you?
Hello, mate. I'm good, thanks. And you?
Yeah, I'm all right. It's wet, it's dreary, it's January, but I'm remaining upbeat.
Yeah, no, it's blowing a hoolie out here, is what we would probably say. Yeah,
Indeed, you are closer to the coast than me. I'm relatively close to the coast, but I'm not as close as you are, and it is windy here.
Yeah, after my second wet walk with our dogs, I'm glad to be inside and not having to do that until tomorrow.
Were you affected by the recent storm? Did I do any?
Didn't actually do any major damage to us. No, we were. I think it missed us actually pretty much in the sense that it was much worse further down in Devon and Cornwall, wasn't it? So yeah,
Cornwall in particular.
Cornwall, a lot places without electric and places without water and all sorts of stuff. Yeah,
I saw one property and the roof had blown off. I think the story was they were sat having dinner and they heard a noise and went upstairs, looked in the attic hatch, and they could see the sky, which makes my predicament with my chimney pale in comparison. So,
God, yeah, makes you want a bungalow that was built only, sort of 20 years ago or something. Yeah, you get a bit worried as some of our houses are a little bit interesting, aren't they, Mark?
Yeah, well, this is it. But you say with the bungalow, now my place is 200 years old, but the bricks, like the chimney, if I try and put a nail in that or a screw, like it is solid. It is not going anywhere. It's just a shame that everything above the roof line is slightly ropey.
Yeah. They built things well back then because they're still here, most of them. So there we go.
Yeah, and it's quite nice because I say nice, but whenever I lift floorboards or something like that, I find some random artifact from like the early 20th, late 19th century, which is always good fun. Or just a bottle of WKD, yeah, which has happened. I found it behind my cupboards. Oh, that was funny.
Excellent.
Anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
So the topic for this episode came about. So I was contacted via my website, synthmusicmastering.com, and it was a very short contact. And it was because on there it says, "What would you like to chat about?" basically, and it was a very short. I'd like to have more clarity in my mix, to paraphrase, or it might have been something along those lines. Clarity in my mix, or my mixes sound muddy. Should have made a note, but it was something along those lines. So I thought it'd be a good idea to start the year, or belatedly start the year, with our thoughts around how we can make mixes clearer, add clarity to our mixes to reduce any. I don't like using the term muddiness too much, but I prefer to use the term clarity in particular. and maybe some pitfalls to avoid. So I've done enough waffling. Maybe if you want to start, mate. If there's somebody were to ask you, what would be the number one thing that you would look out for or recommend for mix clarity?
Yeah, for mixed clarity. I think it starts with your arrangement and it starts with your sound choices. If you get those as close as you can to working well before you have to start reaching for lots of EQ and other things to solve problems, that I would say that is a very good place to start. So you choose a bass sound, for instance, that works with your pad sound, that works with your guitar tone, that works with your vocal, or whatever you've got in your track. It's choosing sounds that don't sort of clash too much in their frequencies, and sort of also writing parts that have enough space in them so that it's funny. It's like if you can create a lot of sort of space in like the way you write a drum part and a bass part, so that they work together well and they don't kind of create a lot of these sort of build-ups of frequencies. Like, I mean, it's, for instance, you could side chaining your bass is a classic idea to get the bass so that it reduces when the kick drum happens, so that you don't have a kick drum happening and a large bass note happening at exactly the same time and have a big swell of bottom end. So that can help get some clarity in your bass. After these sorts of things, which you can work on your arrangement, then I think you are into the sort of realms of EQ. And I think EQ can be quite simple often to sort of, you can use your sort of lower mids and lower mids and low frequencies are often where the mud is occurring. So maybe you've got unnecessary low end in things that you need to filter off. That can be useful using a sort of high pass filter and just sweeping out some of the real low end that you don't need. For instance, you've got a piano part. How much of the low end do you need in the piano part when you've got a bass part already in the track? You probably don't need a lot of what would be the left hand of a piano, the low end of a piano, if you've got bass in there, and it will just clash. So you may be able to filter out some of that. You may be able to filter out low end out of guitar amps and things like that, because you don't really need that kind of frequencies to understand what the guitar is doing. A lot of what the guitar really does is in the upper mids and stuff. So yeah, using your EQ to get it out unnecessary low end frequencies, and then maybe to carve out some of the lower mids where mud tends to sit. So you tend to get a real build up of all these different instruments that cross over and have quite a lot of activity in that sort of 200 to 500, somewhere around that, or 200, 400 sort of range, that kind of lower mid range. And of course, we've got all kinds of clever EQs now, from dynamic EQs and all kinds of clever stuff we can do. But often just a simple channel EQ is a good place to start, just to sort of reduce some of the mud in, and you don't want to take it out of everything. You want to try and work out which elements it's particularly problematic in, or which elements you can remove it from, and it declutters the mix, but it doesn't remove warmth and body from the mix too much, because you don't want to lose all your warmth and body from the mix and make it thin, but you do want to reduce any kind of build up of these frequencies. And you do tend to get them across all of the instruments, will have quite a lot of energy down in that 200 to 400 range, and it can just build up across the mix, and just reducing it a little bit with EQ is probably where I'd start. And I regularly, when I'm mixing other people's projects, that is where I start, is reducing those low frequencies and sort of lower mid frequencies that build up unnecessarily and start muddying things, really.
Let's take a quick break. One of the biggest frustrations I hear is people spending hours trying to master their own tracks and still not trusting the result, especially if mastering feels like the weakest link or you're not even sure what you're listening for yet. A common hesitation is worrying the track will get overprocessed or lose the life of the mix. What I actually focus on is balance and translation, making sure the low end behaves, the highs stay clean, and the track holds together wherever it's played. Clients are often surprised by how straightforward the process feels. Clear communication, honest feedback, and a master that finally makes the track feel finished. Not louder for the sake of it, just ready to release. If you're getting ready to release, head to the Synth Music Mastering website. The link's in the show notes, and request a quote. If you mention the code POD in your message, I'll take 20% off as a thank you for listening. No pressure, it's there if you need it. Yeah, I would agree with everything you've said there. One thing that did come to mind was vocals. And I've seen projects and I've heard projects from people where, because you mentioned there that you don't want to remove too much. And I know, particularly with vocals, I think you need to err on the side of caution sometimes with that, because you can have quite thin sounding vocals. Because, for example, my voice is quite deep. So if I were to attribute some of that to, I'd lose a lot of the
bit
body
of Barry
of my
White
voice.
syndrome there. Yeah.
Indeed, yeah. The later in the day it gets, the deeper my voice gets as well, which is why I quite like recording these later. I should do those, like those Calm, the Calm app where I just tell a story.
Yeah. But you're right. If that's where your voice sits and you've got that nice, deep sort of resonance in your voice, you don't want to go and take it all out. That's kind of the character of your voice. But you might need to carve a bit out of some of the things that are around it.
Exactly, yeah.
So that there's room for it is, I guess, a good place to start anyway.
Yeah. And I think automation as well. Automation can play a big part in that. And I use, as you do as well, with automation to move things around. If there's a lot going on in a particular section with some panning, or maybe it's some time-based effects to push something back or bring something forward, or just volume. Or EQ as well. I automate EQ. I do it a lot on kick drums, to be fair, but more from a creative perspective, rather than moving it out of the way of something. It's more for a creative sort of thing, in particular. But one thing, in particular, when it comes to sort of EQ, I find is sometimes, and I do this more often than not now, is before I reach for an EQ, because I've got something conflicting. One thing I think is quite important for people to do is to mute that or drop it in level and think, actually, is this contributing? I think that also comes back to arrangement, which is what you said right at the beginning. And then actually, if I take this out and it has very little impact on the product as a whole, do I need it? Do I need to waste time with EQ in this instance? Which I think is quite an important thing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's like, I mean, sometimes you just end up with parts that you came up with, and then you've added another part, and you've added another part, and you sometimes have to start going back. Yeah, but now this part is really signature, and this is really working. Does that mean that part I added earlier, is that actually now any use, or is it just redundant and I've left it in the mix, just taking up room? And I find that sometimes I'll have, got too many sounds as well that go in the same register. So try and think where they're sitting, if you've got a sort of nice tambourine part, it's not going to be clashing with your sort of low synth pad. But, your sort of tambourine part might be clashing with the hi-hat part, and you might not need both of them, or you might need to simplify one if you're going to have the other in, or something. Or you might need to change the sound of one a little bit, So, yeah, it's when things sit in the same register that they tend to sort of, take up space and cause clashing. I mean, we're talking more in the lower end of the mix, I know, when we're talking about mud, but it kind of, I don't know, do you think you can separate sort of do you think mud really means everything that's going wrong about the lower end of the mix, or do you think it's clarity in the upper mix as well that we're talking about?
I think it's clarity in the upper mix as well.
Yeah.
Because I think that can often be overlooked in what's going on up there. For example, particular genres, maybe you've got a lot of, you mentioned tambourines there, but you might have a lot of tops going on. You might have shakers, crashes, hi-hats. and all this stuff happening. And if all that's happening in the same space, you're just going to get a massive energy buildup in the higher frequencies as well, which can sound quite harsh, quite busy, and can be very fatiguing on the ears as well.
Yeah, very fatiguing.
That's
just
where
to make everyone turn it down.
yeah, especially if you've got a really bad playback system, and that might be like I've got these Bluetooth headphones, and they favor like the upper mids, high frequencies. And if I listen to something that's remotely harsh, it makes me cringe, which is it's good and bad in a way. I never listen to my mixes on it because I would never make a decision on a mix based on those headphones. But yeah, I think so. I think clarity also comes in the higher frequencies as well.
What do you think about using things like fresh air and some of these sort of like these kind of like, I don't know if you use that by Stephen Slater.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I like
some of these sort of things where sort of enhancements really to the high frequencies, because I mean that is always the question, is sort of, you know, if you're lacking clarity in your mix, do you sort of add more detail at the top end? And I think it can work myself, but I think you have to be judicious and sort of use it on certain elements and be cautious as to how much you're pushing in. You've got to be careful, because when your ears get tired as well and fatigued and you get used to something, you have a tendency to just add a lot more top end in and then like discover later on that it's horribly bright, you know. But
yeah, I use fresh air. I use it much like yourself, judiciously on hats. And to be fair, I use it less now. I think in the last few years, and notably since I've moved into doing more EDM-based stuff, and I focus more now on getting the right sample, which is what I probably should have done way, way sooner. So I use it less, but I still use it. I use it a lot on claps. I do like it on claps. Can add some nice attack on claps. But that's about it. I never use it on a crash. I try and find the best sample for a crash, but I use it very sparingly, particularly with something like fresh air, because it will. And there's also, you've got to be aware of the signal level with it as well. As soon as you even boost it a tiny bit, or you turn that knob, because you can have it linked, you turn one and it does them both. It will that signal level bumps up really quick, really fast. And I find myself having to dip it by 2 or 3 dB. Otherwise, it just sounds way too loud. But I think, like you said, you just got to. I wouldn't use it on everything. Otherwise, it would just sound everything in that sort of upper frequency range. All those instruments. I think it was because you can put it. I've known people put it on a mix bus as well.
Yeah, you've got to be very careful when you put anything on your mix bus, because just a tiny movement will add a lot to the overall thing at that point, because you've probably got a lot of level going into it and you don't need much. But yeah, sometimes these things just work. That is what you need. But another thing I think that can cause mud in mixes is compression. It's not that compression is bad. Compression is very good news, but you've got to watch out a little bit, because if you're over compressing everything, and you end up with everything very undynamic and all a sort of maximum sort of, you know, kind of, you're maxing out the level really. So there's no dynamics in your track. You can find that everything just feels like basically there's no light and shade in the mix, and there's no space. Yeah, flat. You know, and you may, I mean, I think you don't realize it, but if you're sort of with compression basically bringing up the low level signals and reducing the high level signals, and so you're getting a much more even level, that can be good. But equally, you're kind of affecting the frequency to a degree, because you're beginning to sort of, you know, say some of your quieter sounds are sort of bass sounds, for instance. If you haven't filtered out some of the frequencies that you don't want in there, you'll be pushing them up a little bit, and if you'll be bringing down the high frequencies because they're quite bright in the sound. So you can actually affect the frequency, you know, sort of makeup of sounds slightly by over compressing them, and then you end up with everything being very sort of, I don't know, sort of lacking in brightness, and sort of becoming very sort of middly, I find.
Yeah, it's on my list of notes here, actually, exactly what you mentioned there about compression and flattening. And just, we need those. You need transients. You want interesting
Yeah, you
mix,
need
right?
transients. You need
You need those
dynamics in
dynamics.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
you can have night and day whereby you can add and remove parts, which we do, but you also need those dynamics as well to make it interesting to the listener and keep them engaged. Otherwise, it's nothing worse than just a really flat song. You kind
No,
of just like,
exactly. I think it's particularly on things that are like, I'm always cautious on something, say like, I don't know, electric guitar, like strumming sort of like patterns, like or acoustic guitar, or you know, pads or anything that's constant, a constant sound. Be careful that you don't over compress that sound, because if it's fairly constant in level anyway,
yeah.
what are you? Do you
What are you
need
actually
lots
doing?
of compression? Yeah, what are you actually doing? Whereas something, I mean, like a kick or a snare or something that's a sort of short sound, maybe you can really fatten it with a bit of compression, control it, and maybe you need it on your bass sound to keep your bass from sort of jumping up and down in the mix. There are certain things that it really, and vocals, you've got to get that consistency often in a sort of pop track, haven't you, where the vocals sit in the track. So there are things that really benefit from quite a bit of compression in your mix. But if you put quite a bit of compression on everything, but particularly if you don't let the transients through, so you have a very fast attack and a slow release, again, changing your attack and release times can really change the dynamics on things. So you can have compression, but with slower attack and faster release, and then you will still get some of the dynamic coming through. In fact, you can enhance the dynamic. So, yeah. So I think right use of compressions should be in there somewhere.
Definitely agree with that. And it's interesting you mentioned pads there. I find myself, I don't really compress pads. I think I control more of that with regards to the velocity. So I go in and control it that way. I think that comes from when I've had audio as well before, because using things like clip gain. So I do more of that now before hitting a compressor. But I don't know about you, but when it comes to pads, if I do it, it's more for a sort of sound. So the sound of the compressor, maybe sticking, I don't know, hypothetically an LA2A on there, for example.
I use an LA2A quite a lot on pads, but with only a very minimal amount of like gain reduction. It's mainly for the sound on that it adds a little bit of harmonic content to them, which can be really nice. So it's almost the saturation and other things that those modeling compressors add can be quite nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Just before we wrap things up here, circling back to what we were discussing earlier about the top end with regards to adding clarity, do you ever find yourself removing? So if you want to balance something out, rather than adding, say if you've got a top end that's slightly lacking, rather than thinking, okay, well, I need to go and find, or I've identified the problem, I'm now going to use some tools at my disposal to boost, let's say, I'm going to add some saturation to some instruments in the higher frequency range. Or would you carve more out of the sort of yin and yang? Would you carve more out of the lower frequency or the low mids to make them less prominent to boost the highs?
Well, I think that works. I mean, I think that definitely works because it depends how your mix bus is set up. But if you are the kind of person that mix into, and I do actually, I never used to, but I do these days, mix quite all my tracks really. I tend to mix into compression with a little bit of EQ. So I tend to have a few things on my master bus that sort of I'm mixing into. And if you're doing that, you've got to be very careful because you're eating up dynamic range by in your tracks, say with like busy sort of lower mids or something. That will affect the brightness of the track, and if you take those down in level, you will start to not only notice that the frequency sort of opens up within the track, you can sort of notice and hear the highs better, but of course you'll be reducing the volume that you're pushing into your master bus. So if it was compressing, it will be compressing a little bit less. So you've got to be cautious, because if you have lots of lower mid banging in there, and bass is a real classic for it, isn't it? If you've got a lot of bass energy and it's pushing into your mix compressor, it will be acting quite a lot and like reducing the volume a lot, like and that can make your mix sound dull, basically. If you know what I mean. Sometimes reducing the bass is a good way to brighten it up. So
Yeah, it's like the yin and yang, isn't it? It's almost thinking, okay, I'm not immediately going to try and just boost something up here. I'm actually going to try and take something away instead.
a little bit less bass end suddenly makes the track feel more alive and and lighter and brighter in a funny way.
Yeah, it's a tenuous link, but it reminds me of the process I'm going through now. So I'm working on a track that I shared with you, and I'd say I decided to take a different approach to the arrangement side of things, which was kick drum, tops, and a vocal, and I'm then building everything apart from the melody. And I've never done it that way. Usually I would do like kick, get some tops in there, get some sound effects in there, some uplifters and stuff. And then if I've got a vocal, great. If I haven't, I'll then start figuring out, okay, well, what melody am I going to use here? But I've done it the other way. I'm just filling out all the other sounds first. And I'm finding it's quite an interesting way of doing it, because I've now identified that I only need maybe one or two. I need like maybe a lead that fluctuates and changes throughout, and maybe a pad here and there. Whereas previously, if I'd gone the other way, this is me anecdotally talking now, I would have just, like you said, by the time I get to, I often do this, by the time I get to the outro, the last chorus, because my tracks kind of build to this almost like a crescendo, I've got quite a lot going on there, and I end up taking stuff away. But doing it this other way, where I've done everything else, including just like percussion and everything else that fits around it, I'm finding I'm needing less, which is quite an interesting way of doing it. So audience listening, yeah, if you've not ever done it that way, do everything else. If you're not using a vocal, then just use your lead instrument and build everything else around. And then your percussion, uplifters, all that sort of stuff, and even the bass. And then I suppose it works well for like EDM and dance music. It might not work well for sort of a rock band, let's say, or something like that. But it works quite well for what I'm doing. What I find is it just sounds a lot more open.
Yeah.
Open and clear, which is the topic.
Open and clear. Yeah, I end up with
today's episode.
The kitchen sinking by the end if I'm not careful.
Yeah. This is it. And I
All
find that
my ideas.
I know. So I'm like, I like that sound. I'll stick it in there. And I get in, and then I listen at the end of my session. I'll listen. It gets to the end. I'm like, what the fuck is going on at the end here? I've got all this stuff going on. I need to get rid of some bits and pieces. But yeah, it was a slightly tenuous link I was going off on there. I just thought it'd be interesting to raise how sometimes taking a different approach to this, is particularly with arrangement as well, which goes right back to what you said at the beginning about how arrangement is important and what you do there.
I think you mentioned as well, like panning, which it's those simple things like panning and volume as well. It's like I was mastering something this week, and actually the guy's going to go back and look at his mix and just it probably is sort of a frequency thing where he's got a synth and a violin, and they kind of start clashing and they get really quite bright and sharp in the mix. So he's kind of sort of going to work on reducing that a little bit, and that will probably help. But I did say to him, sort of, sometimes it's just like, even looking at that, it might just be volume. It might just be that when you add those two parts together in that section, it's just getting a bit too loud. And if you don't need to do a lot with the frequency, you just need to dip one or other of them a little bit, or both of them in the track, because there's a lead synth and a violin, and they're too loud together, adding together. But if they reduced a little bit, you might find that it worked well in the final track. But yeah, as it is, it's just becoming a bit harsh, But yeah, it's funny that. And again, if you pan them slightly left and right so that they're not in the same space, you can have things that are both sitting in the same frequency range, and they sit there okay when they're panned a bit further apart. But right in the center of the mix together, they're kind of too much. So, yeah.
Yeah, agreed, mate, agreed. And one thing I would add to the end of that is do all those steps first before you reach for a Silver Bullet AI plugin that will add clarity to your mix. I would say don't rely on that, sticking a plugin on it and then it fixing it for you. Get it right at source.
Oh yes,
Get
definitely.
it right at source.
That is the old adage, and it's a
indeed. But pretty much with every step of the music process, really, in general. So there we go, folks. Clearer mixes don't come from better plugins, as I mentioned at the end there. They come from clearer decisions and what matters. So my challenge to you, what's the part in your mix that might be doing too much? Try muting one track before your next EQ move. Send us a message in the episode notes. In the show notes, there's a send me a message link and let us know. Alternatively, ask us a question that you might want featured on a later episode. And if you've enjoyed this one, go check out episode 175. Also with Tim as well. What's the secret to mixing without muddiness? Looks like we're circling back on a similar conversation. And it would also be interesting to listen back to that one and see if we've totally changed our perspective. I'd like to think no, but then again, you never know. Tim, before we sign off, as we always do, any news, anything coming up?
Yes,
general,
I have.
Music-wise,
I don't know when
life?
this comes out, but I shall have a new track out probably at the end of January. I've just been working on a new release for my R9 project. It's called Phosphorescent, and it's an instrumental sort of synthwave kind of vibe. So that'll be coming out. Trying to think what else I've been working on. I've been doing some various projects with local folk here in different musical genres, and then I'm sort of also trying to get round to doing some of my own song-based things as a different sort of. I'll probably release them under my own name or whatever, or a different artist name. But but more R9 stuff coming as well. Trying to figure out some slightly new directions for this year, but like not straying too far from what I've been doing.
Lovely stuff, mate. This is going to come out on the 3rd of Feb. So it would have been out by then. So I'll put a link in the episode description as I always do. So looking forward to that one. So cheers, Tim. It was always a pleasure. We'll do it again in next month at some point. And folks, if this has helped, do also click the link in the episode description and jump on my mailing list. Now, it sounds spammy. I promise you it's not. I send you once a week. I'll send you an email with some tips and tricks on music production and mixing, and there's no automated email chain or anything like that. So if you want more tips and tricks in your inbox, do sign up for that. You can click the link in the show notes. And until next time, big thank you, Tim. Folks, keep creating, keep mixing, and I will see you in the next episode. The biggest change people mention after mastering isn't loudness, it's confidence. They stop tweaking, stop second guessing, and actually enjoy listening to their track again. If you want to take the next step, check the link in the show notes and request a quote. And if you include the code POD in your message, there's a 20% listener thank you discount.